You begin to notice it not as a dramatic shift but as a quiet repetition, something that forms slowly over time, where your financial life seems to move forward in visible ways while internally it feels as though nothing meaningful is changing, creating a strange disconnect between what should feel like progress and what actually registers as improvement, as if each new level simply replaces the last without ever delivering a lasting sense of arrival. At first, the pattern is easy to ignore because the early stages of financial growth tend to feel rewarding in a direct and measurable way, where increases in income or savings translate almost immediately into improvements in daily life, reducing stress, expanding options, and creating a sense of momentum that feels both motivating and tangible, reinforcing the belief that continued effort will produce equally noticeable results. But over time, something begins to shift in a way that is difficult to articulate, where the same increments that once felt significant start to feel smaller, not because they are objectively less valuable, but because your baseline has quietly adjusted upward, absorbing each gain into a new normal, and in doing so, reducing the emotional impact that once made progress feel meaningful. This is where the concept of the financial plateau begins to take shape, not as a failure or a lack of growth, but as a structural feature of how humans perceive change, where the mind recalibrates expectations faster than systems can produce noticeable differences, creating a loop in which progress continues externally while satisfaction stabilizes internally. Psychologically, this pattern is deeply rooted in adaptation, where repeated exposure to improved conditions gradually reduces their perceived value, causing what once felt like advancement to become routine, and what was once routine to feel insufficient, leading to a constant repositioning of what counts as enough, without any deliberate decision to redefine it. As a result, the plateau is not defined by a lack of financial movement, but by a lack of perceived acceleration, where each step forward feels similar in weight to the previous one, even if the numerical difference is larger, creating the impression that effort is producing diminishing returns despite evidence to the contrary. Mathematically, this can be understood through relative change rather than absolute numbers, because the impact of an increase is always measured against the existing base, meaning that a gain of $1,000 feels significant when your total is $5,000, but much less so when your total is $50,000, even though the absolute increase remains identical. Over time, this relationship creates a subtle distortion in perception, where larger gains are required to produce the same psychological effect, effectively raising the threshold for what feels like progress, and making it increasingly difficult to experience the same sense of advancement that characterized earlier stages. At the same time, financial systems themselves often reinforce this plateau effect, as expenses tend to scale alongside income in ways that are not always intentional, gradually absorbing new resources into recurring costs, lifestyle adjustments, and expectations that become normalized, reducing the visible impact of growth and further stabilizing the feeling of being in place. This creates a feedback loop where both perception and structure align to maintain the plateau, with the mind adjusting to new levels while external systems quietly expand to match them, making it appear as though progress has slowed or even stopped, when in reality it has simply been redistributed across a larger and more complex baseline. From a broader perspective, this pattern is not unique to individuals but reflects a larger economic principle, where systems tend to stabilize around equilibrium points, and where growth, once it reaches a certain scale, becomes less about rapid visible change and more about incremental adjustments that are harder to perceive in real time. Historically, similar patterns can be observed in economies that experience rapid early growth followed by extended periods of stabilization, where expansion continues but at a pace that feels less transformative, leading to a collective sense that progress has stalled even when underlying metrics suggest otherwise. What makes the financial plateau particularly persistent is that it is not caused by a single factor, but by the interaction between human psychology, mathematical scaling, and systemic behavior, all of which converge to create a consistent experience across different income levels and financial stages. The result is a repeating cycle where each new level eventually becomes another plateau, not because growth has ended, but because perception has adapted to the point where further movement requires disproportionately larger changes to be noticed, effectively resetting the starting line each time progress is made. Understanding this does not eliminate the plateau, but it changes how it is interpreted, shifting the focus away from chasing the feeling of progress and toward recognizing the underlying structure that produces it, allowing you to see that what feels like stagnation is often a normal phase within a much longer trajectory. In this way, the plateau becomes less of a barrier and more of a signal, indicating that the system has reached a level of stability where visible change is no longer the primary indicator of movement, and where progress continues in ways that are quieter, slower, and less emotionally pronounced. And once this shift in interpretation begins to take hold, the experience of financial growth starts to change again, not by restoring the intensity of early gains, but by replacing the need for constant validation with a clearer understanding of how progress actually unfolds over time, in patterns that are consistent, repeatable, and far less dependent on how they feel in any given moment.